Well, good morning, everyone. I trust that you had a great holiday season and your 2021 is off to a great start. Um, and of course, I hope you've stayed healthy through all of this as well. So just want to invite you to our next webinar series today, which is part of the series, A Road to Continuous Improvement. Today, we're going to be discussing emergency planning and response. Obviously, emergency responding and response for most of us is not very exciting, but yet it's a very important part of your overall management system and including improving your process safety when it comes to how you plan and how you respond to emergencies. Probably in 2019, I could probably tell you that and I know this is 2021, but 2019, we had several facilities that in the area here in the Houston area that had incidents. And out of those incidents, those companies no longer in business. And part of that was due to how they responded and planned for emergencies. And they didn't do that very well. And obviously then that takes a toll on financials as well for the company. So we're going to talk about continuous improvement here and how we continuously improve our emergency planning and response. First of all, like all others, we're going to kind of talk about what we've done thus far. And obviously, we've went through most of the PSM elements, starting with management systems all the way down through incident investigations last time. And today, again, we'll be talking about emergency planning and response. So when I look at just the regulation itself, I've highlighted a couple of areas, and these are the areas that we see a lot of issues with when we do compliance audits. And I'm going to talk about some of those gaps here in just a minute. But when we look at the regulation itself, it says the employer shall establish and implement an emergency action plan for the entire plant. And now that's key. A lot of facilities may only do it for a process or something like that, but it has to be for the whole plant. And it has to be in accordance with the provisions of 29 CFR 1910.38. In addition, the emergency action plan shall include procedures for handling small releases. Another important point to remember here, and we're going to talk about that in fairly large detail here shortly. Also, employers covered under this standard must also be subject to, may also be subject to the hazardous waste and emergency response provisions contained in 29 CFR 1910.120 or HAZWOPER regulations. So we're going to talk about those three specific things quite a bit here over the next half hour or so. So what's the purpose and intent of emergency planning and response? Obviously, it's for continuous improvement. It's better planning and response to emergencies. And that's the key at what you want to come out of with a good emergency response plan is being able to plan for those emergencies and respond when those emergencies do occur. It's not a matter if they occur, it's when they occur, and they will occur at some point in time, and how you respond to those is fairly important. And of course, as part of the continuous improvement, we need to be looking at improving our evacuation routes, for example, make sure that the routes are in the right places, et cetera. Improving our on-site response. And what that means, if you have personnel in your facility that are designated as having certain responsibilities within your plan, making sure that their response is in accordance with what you've written as your plan should be and what their response should be as part of that plan. And so that requires you to do some type of exercise or some type of drill to make sure that they understand their roles and responsibilities. It's also for improving our offsite response. And what I mean by that is not only if you have a response plan that requires that you use outside emergency responders, that's one piece of it. But how do you respond when you have an emergency within your facility and communicating that information outside the fence to those to the people in the community, your schools, your other businesses, et cetera? That should all be part of your emergency response plan as well. Is how do you make those communications and how do you ensure that that communication has taken place and it's well documented. Also improving, like we said, your evacuation routes, making sure that our routes are well laid out. Earlier we talked about improving just evacuation. How do we do evacuation? Just sound a horn and everybody runs, or what do we do? And that's what we talk about when we talk about evacuation, not only the routes, but also the plan and how we are going to organize our people. Also improving accountability for personnel. And that's just not only your employees in your facility, but contractors as well. I see that as a huge gap in most facilities when we do a compliance audit, is how they account for contractors. A lot of times they'll say, well, the contractor just calls us in and tells us everybody's there. Well, it has to go beyond that. And based on a number of incident investigations that we've done, there have been a lot of contractors that just didn't get accounted for, even though they may not been in the facility, but when you called the contractor, they didn't know where they were at for sure. So making sure that we account for everybody that's in our facilities is an important part of our emergency response plans as well. We need to plan and train to not make a bad situation worse. And a lot of times, if you haven't properly developed your emergency response plan and your training, when you come to an actual emergency, you could actually make the emergency worse, or the overall result worse, because you weren't prepared to handle that emergency. Went the wrong way. So some of the gaps we see quite often is and you're going to see this number is fairly high, failure to define a small spill release. Remember, I looked back, and when we looked at the regulation itself, it specifically called out defining what a small spill release is. So 77% of all the audits that we do, there's a gap here in defining what that small spill is, either not saying anything at all about it, or not addressing it significantly with enough detail to determine what who can respond to a small spill or release or large release, et cetera. And then it's failure to provide the proper training of responders. Mainly this is HAZWOPER, and it really has to do with the small spill. So if you don't define what a small spill is, and you have an employee that responds, doesn't matter whether it's a drip or a gallon or two drums or whatever the case may be, they would have to have been properly trained to be able to respond. So normally that's a HAZWOPER training. Now, if you define what your small spill is as a de minimis amount, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, then you may not need to have that HAZWOPER training. So the two go hand in hand together. The next one is failure to provide proper training. And this is mainly for fire, medical emergencies, and even on the EAP or ERP itself, 52% of the time. So where do we find this information? Well, we interview employees. We interview employees that have specific responsibilities. In fact, if your plan says that they respond to medical emergencies, then we'll want to see their training, that they've been properly trained to be able to respond to those type of emergencies. Same way, if they're designated as a firefighter, they'll respond to fires above and beyond the incipient stage. Are they properly trained to do that? Even if your employees are allowed to respond to incipient fires using a fire extinguisher, et cetera, well, they have to be properly trained to be able to use that. The next one is failure to fully comply with the requirements outlined in 29 CFR 1910.165, and that's the employee alarm system. So if you go back to 1910.138, it specifically outlines that you must also follow 1910.165 when it comes to alarm systems. And we'll talk about that here in just a second as well. Next is a failure to fully comply with the requirements outlined in 1910.38, the whole regulation on how to do emergency plan and how to put that together. About 23% of the audits we do have gaps there as well. And then failure to conduct a drill. And I put this one last, even though it's 56%, because really there are no specific requirements from a PSM standpoint to do drills. However, RMP, you will be required to do some drills here shortly as well. So if you haven't done one already, you will need to do some drills for that as well. But I do put it on here from the standpoint because it's so important. If we want to continuously get better, then we need to plan, we need to drill, we need to practice, make it muscle memory on the things that we want our employees to do. So we really have two types of emergency response plans, if you will. One is a response plan, and what I always tell people is you can think about a response as people are going to the emergency. They're responding to a fire. They're helping to fight the fire. They're responding to a medical emergency. They have been properly trained to do those sort of things. Maybe they're also cleaning up a spill or responding to a major release, etc. That would be more of a response plan. An action plan is where the employees evacuate. So they find that the fire, for example, is beyond the incipient stage. Well, then they're going to exit and let the professionals do that. Maybe they have a spill that's above and beyond what we'll call the IDLH or LEL conditions. Well, then the professionals will address that, and they're just going to evacuate. So that would be a response plan. So or that would be an action plan. So again, action plan, the people are going. The response plan is people are going to the emergency. Action plan, people are leaving the emergency, leaving the facility. So the basic plan elements, and we'll go through this pretty quick, is it describes the procedures for handling small releases and spills. And you have small toxic releases. For example, some of you are in ammonia refrigeration. I know you're going to have a small toxic spill, and normally those small toxic spills can be handled basically by IDLH concentrations to a certain extent. Maybe some liquid also needs to be defined in what your small spill release is as well. Small flammables are things that usually less than LEL conditions. So if it's above LEL conditions, then more training is going to need to be provided for those type of responses. So it must address all three levels of emergency response, and I'm going to be talking about those levels here just shortly. Must have procedures for emergency evacuation, must address the alarm system, must address training requirements. All of those things are in the basic plan elements themselves. Must have escape procedures and routes, procedures for post-evacuation employee contractor accounting. Must have preferred means to report emergencies. For example, you don't want everyone in your facility calling 911. You want to have a plan that designates who has responsibility in general for making those calls to emergency responders, but also for how your employees report emergencies. How do they call in to report something that needs responders to respond? Again, you don't want everybody calling one person and then nobody answers. Sort of like sometimes you call 911 and they put you on hold because the system is overwhelmed. Must have the duties and procedures of employees and who will remain behind to operate critical equipment. So if everybody evacuates, you could still have somebody that stays behind to shut down the equipment in an orderly manner. That would have to be documented in your emergency response plan. And just as an added piece of information, that would also need to be in your emergency response procedures within your SOP as well. So what they're going to do in event of emergency has to be clearly documented in your emergency procedures in terms of SOPs as well. And then who will perform rescue and medical duties, and who are the names of those people? Who are they, and what was their responsibilities, and what is their training, and what kind of level of response can they provide? Can they just do, for example, broken bones or fractures or minor contusions or cuts, et cetera? Or can they do much more than that? Do they have the ability to use a EAD, et cetera? So all of those things should be outlined in your plan. So there's, again, three levels of emergency response. Level one is a community-wide emergency that seriously impairs or halts the operation of the area. Outside emergency service would be needed. Major policy consideration decisions would also be required. Good examples of this are mass casualties, natural disasters such as an earthquake or tornado, large-scale hazardous material spills, et cetera. Those are typical level one emergencies. Level twos are serious emergency that completely disrupt one or more operations of the facility and or the town and may affect mission critical functions or life safety. Outside emergency services, well, major efforts for emergency service would be required. Some examples of that are hostage situations, maybe a major fire, civil disturbance, bomb threats, etc. Level 3 are those minor emergency, any localized, contained incidents, quick resolved with internal resources or limited help. It does not affect the overall functioning capacity of the plant or the city. Examples of this are small fires, small hazardous material incidents, and limited power outages. Those are the 3 levels of emergencies that should be outlined in your plan. Excuse me. As we talked about earlier, an important part of your emergency response should be identifying and addressing alarm systems. Must have and develop an early warning method for releases, like maybe you have sensors, alarms, and then they need to be able to clearly notify employees of hazardous release. For example, I know I go into a number of ammonia refrigeration facilities that they may only have one alarm, and that alarm is an ammonia, but then they have fire alarms as well. So then they have may have other alarms associated with weather, or should have with weather-related concerns, etc. All of those alarms should be designated with different sounds or different meanings, so your employees can hear the emergency tone and know what they need to do. And of course, we need to be training on the meaning of those alarms, especially if you have those multiple alarms in your facility. So your evacuation plans must be written and designated on your designated assembly points shown on your evacuation maps. And those evacuation routes should be based on release characteristics or prevailing winds. For example, don't make both of the assembly points on the same side of a building, for example. So it may be that they can't exit that way. So we need to provide enough alternative exit areas or exit routes so that they can get to a safe assembly area without passing through a cloud or passing through a toxic release, etc. That's why you need to provide alternative assembly areas and need to be able to communicate which assembly area they need to go to, especially when it involves building a facility that has building. In other words, you have a number of employees within a building, and this pertains specifically to ammonia refrigeration facilities for sure, where you may have a release of ammonia, but the alarm sounds and the release of ammonia could be right in the path of people exiting the building. So there has to be a method for communicating with employees to make sure that they understand which route needs to be taken in some cases. In some cases, the best place is to shelter in place, and those things need to be documented in your response plans. We talked a minute ago about HAZWOPER, and specifically when you don't put in your emergency response plan or address small spills and releases, then your people may need to be HAZWOPER trained to be able to respond to spills. Doesn't matter what size, they would still have to be properly trained through HAZWOPER or hazardous waste operations training. The response level will really, when we look at small spills and releases, we're talking about responses above LEL and LDLH values. And we could say that if they're below those values, then we can say that they're small. If they're above those values, then it's hard to argue that those are small releases anymore, because they take additional PPE. For example, an SCBA, if you're an LDH, in some cases, for example, ammonia, if you're above IDLH values, then you will need an SCBA to respond and no longer can use a full face air purifying respirator. Annual refresher training is always based on the level of HAZWOPER training that you've been provided. But for the most part, it's about 8 hours. And I always tell people to avoid classroom refresher training. Classroom is okay, but it doesn't allow your people that have actually are going to be expected to respond to an incident to be actually trained and drill to what they're actually expected to do. You can have them practice actually donning their equipment. And I know that if any of you on here that are listening here today do have HAZWOPER training, you know to put on a class A or level A suit is not something that takes 3 or 4 minutes to do. So you need time to be able to do that. Obviously, if you're putting on that equipment, you're training, you're planning. So when a real emergency comes up, you're not having to remember how I put this piece of equipment on, what goes on first, etc. You've already trained and practiced putting that equipment on. That can count towards your 8 hours of annual refresher training. The next piece is training on taking the equipment off or decontaminating yourself, etc. And the whole process of setting all of this up takes time, and that time can be used and be documented towards your 8-hour refresher training. The other thing that you can do is actually practice responding to a mock release or a mock emergency response, where you're actually going into the facility, you're suiting up, going into the facility and doing a mock recovery or a mock rescue, etc., or a mock closing a valve. All of these things you can do in practice. That practice then would be counted towards your 8-hour refresher requirements. Those are 8 hours of good training. Now that when you have an incident that occurs, you can apply that training and that knowledge and what you've learned to make that response much more efficient. Again, drills and exercises. And now we're just going to talk about the drills and exercise of a response. So annual emergency preparedness drills are important. Now, they can be tabletop exercises. They don't always have to be a full scale, call the fire department, call all the emergency responders out, etc. But certainly walking through it from a tabletop standpoint, making sure that you can identify gaps in your process even before maybe you have a brand new plan or you revise your plan. The tabletop exercise can help identify those gaps fairly quickly and where your gaps are. Then you want to move it to the next step where you're actually getting people involved, the responders involved, and making sure that they understand the steps involved, etc. And then always include HAZWOPER response. If you're using HAZWOPER or hazmat teams from outside your facility, it'd be a great idea to get them involved as well. And we'll talk about why that's important here in just a second. And then, of course, always document your results and critique yourselves and make sure that you're addressing those gaps and making yourself better and making yourself continuously improve that process of planning an emergency response. So best practice and next steps are really to define a small spill. Now, a lot of people will ask me, what's a small spill? And I cannot always answer that question. What I do say is look at it from a standpoint of IDLH, LEL. And if you're expecting your people to respond to anything above IDLH conditions, then that would be no longer a small spill. Same way with LEL. If they're responding to anything where their monitors would indicate that they're above LEL conditions, then they shouldn't be responding unless they're properly trained. Now, you also would have to look at, from a liquid standpoint, what kind of response you'd have there as well. Maybe the IDLH conditions and LEL would not come into play then, but in most cases, it does come into play. I know, for example, let's take LEL, for example. If you're responding to a condition, you have a monitor, let's say you have a monitor on that's monitoring LEL, and that 25% alarm goes off, then you need to define what that person can do. Can they respond to anything at 25, 50, 75% of LEL? If they can, put that in your emergency response plan. Or if they can't, then you need to define exactly what they need to do. And that's how you can define your small spills and release. For example, the other example would be, for example, a toxic like ammonia, for example. For ammonia, if you have an operator that has a handheld or they even have a personal monitor on, when it reaches 300 ppm or greater, then they can't respond to that anymore unless they've been properly trained and have all of the HAZWOPER training to respond to that sort of thing. And that includes all of the proper PPE training as well. Another good point is to document how employees respond to those small spills and large spills. How do you want them to respond? It goes hand in hand with that small spill documentation as well. Also review your EAP and ERP with all responders. You'd be surprised how many times I talk to local hazmat teams or fire departments when we're reviewing their RMP. Well, they'll say, well, I didn't even know we were supposed to go out there. And we didn't know we were supposed to even respond. So there really hasn't been any communication, even though you might have sent them a letter and everything else. Just like most of us, a lot of times we get a letter in the mail, we don't always read everything that we should. And that's what some of these LAPCs will do as well. They may not read that. So getting them to come out and be involved in a tabletop or involved in a drill is a really good thing. In fact, we just completed one just here before Christmas. Well, actually, just before Thanksgiving, actually, we had a facility, ammonia refrigeration facility in Louisiana, that we had invited the fire department, the hazmat teams, and everything else to be involved in a drill, and they jumped at the chance to do that because it allowed them to train their people, and also it give them an opportunity to show how they respond to the community on events like that as well. So not always easy to get those set up, but they are worth it if you can do that. The other thing I want to talk about is conduct an initial tabletop drill to look for gaps in your response. And I mentioned that earlier. It's so important that even if you have not done a drill to this point yet, it's important to go through and do just a tabletop to make sure that you don't have any major gaps in your planning and response. Also understand response times. This one's important from the standpoint of how long does it take the fire department to get to your facility? How long does it take the hazmat team to get to your facility? How long does it take emergency services such as the ambulance and or the sheriff or the police department to get to your facilities? Why is that important? Well, it's important from the standpoint of if you want to make a situation a rescue rather than a recovery, then you need to know those responses. If those responses are not adequate to result in a rescue rather than a response or a recovery, then you want to maybe do something different. Ensure that there are different alarms for different emergencies. I think that's important to know. One of the things we have in a number of facilities, and this may be in your facilities as well, that your primary language for some of your employees may not be English. So they may not understand when you tell them to evacuate. They may not understand when you tell them what the route is, or they may not understand when they hear a sound, what exactly that means. So if we have different sounds for different emergencies, then our employees know exactly what the response should be. Fire is to evacuate, for example. Ammonia or LEL is to maybe evacuate or shelter in place, or maybe you have a weather emergency. That means shelter in place. So if we train people on the tones and we train people on what those tones mean, then they'll respond in the way that we want them to. Also train employees and contractors on those alarm meanings and verify. And what I mean by that is make sure that from a contractor, when they come into your facility, make sure that they understand what those alarms mean and that we verify that they understand what they mean. Also train employees on first aid, fire extinguisher use, etc., if they're expected to respond. So if you want your employees to render first aid, then obviously we need to train your employees on first aid, on how to provide first aid. how to use a fire extinguisher, etc. And then fully train on other response duties. So if you have other response duties in your plan, such as responding to fires beyond the incipient stage, making sure that your employees have the proper training to do that. Same way with HAZWOPER, etc. Remember, our emergency plan should be planning for the worst. Practice makes response much more effective, and that's what the drills are for. Remember, a speedy and efficient response can mean the difference between a rescue, and what I mean by that is we're trying to rescue a person that's hurt or has fallen or something to that effect, versus recovery. And what I mean by recovery is they're already deceased and we're just recovering a body, and we don't want to do that. We want to be in the rescue mode, not in the recovery. That's why it's so important to understand your response time, be able to train and make sure that people understand what to do in the event of emergency and what they cannot do in emergency as well, such as a release, making sure that they're not going to a release that is going to cause them to be harmed. For example, it's above the LALs, above the LH value, etc. So making sure we're training and making sure people understand that. So open it up for any questions here for anyone, written as well. While you're formulating your questions, if you have any for me today, want to invite everybody back for 1 o'clock webinar this afternoon. If you have not signed up already, we're going to be talking about a service that we provide here at PSS called Total Compliance. Mainly it addresses, it's for ammonia refrigeration facilities, but we also provide PSM coordinator services for just about any industry. We typically contract with some of our clients to provide PSM coordinator services. And what we do with that is the whole idea is behind teaching and training those next employees that you have that will be involved in PSM, helping them to learn PSM, helping them to apply PSM, also helping them to understand process safety and get better at what they're doing. In our total compliance package, typically what we'll do there is provide other services beyond that, just to help people stay in compliance. So invite you to come back at 1 o'clock this afternoon. If you have not registered for that, feel free to send me an email or text. My email down here shortly. I'll put my email up there now. Feel free to send me an email and I'll get you an invite and hope you'll join us for that. So I have one question here. Should somebody had asked whether or not the EAP, which is the Emergency Action Plan, and the ERP, which is Emergency Response Plan, should these be in the same one plan or different plan? Actually, you're either going to be one or the other, and so it'll be one plan. So even if you only respond to one thing, for example, you just respond to large releases, you're all HAZWOPER trained, now you're a response plan. All the other things you're going to evacuate for, perhaps. So it really doesn't matter. As long as you respond to one thing, then it's going to always be a response plan. If you don't respond to anything, it's going to be an action plan, and that's the way it's written. So a person could come into your facility and ask for your emergency response plan, even though it's a generic term, and they can look at that response plan real quick to determine whether or not your employees are evacuating or if anybody is responding. And that's really what we're looking for, and that's what your employees need to see as well. Hopefully that answered your question. Any more questions? So if not, next month we'll be doing the final elements within this series. We're going to be discussing compliance audits and trade secrets. Since trade secrets is usually pretty quick, one slide, we're going to combine those with compliance audits. We also have a number of other webinars coming up addressing some of the issues that we've identified in terms of gaps as we went through this series. I know that I've gotten quite a bit of responses from some of you about certain questions that you'd like to get answered, et cetera, or had questions regarding how to apply that specific element to what you do. And so we're kind of developing some webinars that address those specific gaps and how you can improve that way. But we'll also have, most of these are going to be on demand. So if you have people that you're bringing on as new employees and they want to learn more about PSM, feel free to get in those on demand webinars as well. And we'll probably start this series all over again, maybe starting mid-year, and do it again. And as long as we're getting people signed up, we'll continue to do these. So hopefully you got something out of this one today, and look forward to seeing you at 1 o'clock today as well. And again, feel free to send me any emails or questions that you might have. I'll be glad to respond to those as quickly as I can. Thank you all and have a great day.